The forest was silent that morning. Only the wind moved, whispering through the pines, carrying a scent the farmer hadn't smelled in nearly a year. It was faint at first, then stronger, and when he looked out toward the frost-covered fields, he saw them, a pack of wolves emerging from the mist. At the front, limping slightly, was the alpha wolf he had shot 11 months earlier, the same wolf that had once saved his farm. He froze. His breath turned white in the cold. It couldn't be her. He had seen her fall. But there she was, her eyes steady and calm, the morning sun reflecting on her scarred fur. Behind her, the pack spread wide like a silent army, watching, waiting. And in that stillness, the farmer felt something strange. Not fear, but recognition. 11 months after she was shot, the alpha wolf had returned with her pack. Not in rage, not to attack, but for something he couldn't yet understand. The air felt charged, heavy with memory. He wanted to run, but he couldn't move. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He remembered the day it happened, the echo of the rifle, the flash of red, the silence that followed. He had told himself it was mercy, that she was just another predator. But now, staring into those eyes again, he felt a truth rise within him. She had come back, and she hadn't come alone. They used to call her Shadow. She was the kind of wolf that could move through the trees without a sound, a streak of silver against the snow. The pack followed her without question, not because she was the strongest, but because she was calm and clever. When other wolves took down prey with speed, she did it with patience. And in that patience, she had learned the rhythm of the forest and of the humans who lived on its edge. The farmer never meant to become her enemy. His name was Daniel Cole, a man who'd inherited more land than he could care for and more fear than he'd ever admit. For months, something had been killing his livestock, and fear has a way of turning ordinary men into hunters. Every night he'd sit by the window with his rifle, telling himself he was protecting what was his. Until the night he saw her. She didn't run like the others. Instead, she circled the field, her golden eyes fixed on something beyond the fences. Then she did something that made him hesitate. She turned away from the sheep and charged toward the dark tree line. Moments later, a coyote pack burst out from the shadows, scattering in panic. She hadn't come to hunt. She had come to protect. That was the moment that should have changed everything. But fear is louder than truth. When the morning came and he saw the dead sheep again, he remembered only the shape of a wolf, not the act of a guardian. And the forest never forgets the sound of betrayal. The snow began early that year. Fine, soft flakes drifting down from a colorless sky. By dawn, the forest had become a quiet cathedral of white and silence. Daniel Cole stood on his porch, rifle in hand, watching his breath fade into the cold. He hadn't slept. Every sound beyond the fence set his nerves on edge. The crack of a branch, the distant howl, the echo of his own heartbeat. For weeks, something had been stirring the livestock again. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, had appeared near the barn. He knew them by now, the tracks of a wolf. He told himself it was a different one. It had to be. The alpha wolf he had seen before, the one that turned away from the sheep that saved his farm once, couldn't have returned. Still, he chambered a bullet, just in case. That night, the storm deepened. Wind howled through the trees, tearing at the shutters, and Daniel's lantern cast long, trembling shadows across the floor. He waited. Every night, he had waited for 11 months. The guilt never left him, but fear has a way of rewriting memory, and when the first howl pierced the wind, long and low, something inside him snapped back into its old rhythm. He stepped onto the porch, breath sharp, rifle raised. In the distance, movement, grey against white, a shape slipping between the trees. He steadied his aim, finger trembling against the trigger. The figure paused. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the forest for a single instant, and he saw her. Scarred muzzle, limping gait, eyes of gold fixed on him. It was her. Time fractured. He wanted to lower the gun, to call out, to undo what he had done, but instinct is quicker than thought. The rifle kicked back against his shoulder, the sound ripping through the valley. The bullet fell, cutting the silence in two. The echo faded, replaced by the rush of wind and the faint cry of something unseen. Daniel's hands trembled. He stepped forward, snow crunching under his boots. But the wolf was gone, vanished into the storm like smoke through fingers. All that remained were drops of crimson against the snow, quickly swallowed by the falling flakes. He stood there for a long time, rifle lowered, chest heavy. The wind whispered through the trees like a voice he couldn't silence, and as dawn broke, Daniel felt the forest watching him, patient, ancient, and alive. He didn't know it yet, but what he thought was an ending was only the beginning of what was coming back for him. Winter lingered longer than anyone remembered. It was as if the forest itself refused to move on. The snow that should have melted in March stayed until April, hard and crusted, like the land was holding its breath. Daniel's world shrank to the edges of his fence, the same fence that once divided the wild from the tame. Now it felt like a line carved between two kinds of guilt. He stopped hunting, stopped sleeping. The rifle that once hung proudly by the door now leaned forgotten in a corner, a dust collecting on its barrel. At night he still woke to sounds he couldn't name, a creak, a gust, the faint echo of a howl carried on the wind. Each time his heart would tighten, expecting an answer that never came. The villagers stopped visiting. Some said the wolves had moved north. Others whispered that Daniel had gone strange, that he spoke to the wind as if it could hear him. He didn't deny it. Sometimes when the nights were long and the moon full, he would stand by the fence and whisper into the dark, "I'm sorry." But the forest never replied. He rebuilt the barn that spring, though nothing had been torn down. Repetition became his way of pretending life still had shape. He mended fences that weren't broken, oiled hinges that didn't squeak, fed animals that barely ate. Every motion was a confession without words, the kind that no priest could absolve. Then came the thaw. The snow softened and streams began to move again beneath the ice. The forest came alive in slow motion. Birds returning, branches bending, the hush of melting water. But something was missing. No tracks in the mud, no howls in the distance. The silence that once felt peaceful now pressed against his chest like a weight. One morning, while gathering wood, he found a single paw print behind the barn. Faint, old, washed almost away by rain. It was larger than a dog's, smaller than a bear's, and perfectly familiar. He knelt, tracing the edge of it with trembling fingers. The shape stirred, something he thought he'd buried. That night the wind changed. It blew from the north, colder than it should have been. The horses grew restless. The dogs refused to leave the porch. And deep in the valley, under a sky bruised with clouds, a single howl rose. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A sound that slipped under the door and into his bones. Daniel's eyes opened in the dark. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The sound faded, swallowed by distance, leaving only the pulse of his heart in its wake. And in that emptiness he whispered into the cold air, barely audible even to himself. Shadow. The forest began to whisper again, not in words but in rhythms, a branch creaking under unseen weight, a rustle where there shouldn't be wind, a shape half seen and gone again. Daniel noticed first in the mornings when the fog still clung to the ground. His animals, once calm, had started glancing toward the trees more often. The dogs would bark, not in anger, but in confusion, as if sensing something familiar they couldn't name. At night, he began hearing footsteps, soft, deliberate, never close enough to see, but close enough to feel. One evening, while locking the barn, he caught sight of eyes in the dark. amber and steady. They didn't glow like a predator's. They shimmered, patient, watchful. When he blinked, they were gone. The next morning, he found bones near the edge of the woods, deer remains stripped clean and neatly arranged. No scavenger worked that way. He recognized it instantly. It was the pattern of wolves, the way they ate, the way they shared. But something about it felt ceremonial, almost restrained. He crouched beside the remains and whispered, "You're here, aren't you?" The forest didn't answer, but the air changed. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faintest trace of musk and pine. Then faintly, from somewhere deep in the valley came a howl, low, distant, yet unmistakable. It wasn't the sharp cry of hunger, it was a call, measured, familiar. That night, Daniel lit no lamp. He sat in the dark by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes twisting in the wind. Then a shadow crossed the field. Not alone. Several shapes followed, weaving silently through the whiteness, like ghosts born from memory. He pressed his hand to the glass. The lead figure stopped. Even through the blur of snow, he could see the scar, faint but real, running across her shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. The alpha wolf had survived. She stood still, head raised, her pack forming a half-circle behind her. No growls, no threat, only silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, she lowered her head, not in submission but in recognition. And before Daniel could speak, she turned and disappeared back into the trees, as if the moment had never happened. He stood for a long time after, hand still on the glass, heart hammering in disbelief. He didn't know what it meant. Was it forgiveness? A warning? Or something older, something the forest understood, but humans had long forgotten? All he knew was that the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, waiting, breathing, remembering. By the next morning, the prints were everywhere. Not just one trail, but dozens, circling the barn, crossing the creek, winding through the frozen grass. The wolves had returned. Daniel followed them carefully, his boots sinking into the half-melted snow. Each step felt like walking deeper into a story that no longer belonged to him. The forest was alive again, but it was different now. He could feel it, a pulse beneath the earth, steady and ancient. Crows moved through the treetops, following him in silence. Somewhere ahead, he heard rustling, a rhythm too measured to be wind. And then he saw them. 12, maybe 13 wolves. Their coats thick with frost, their movements fluid and synchronized, like a single body breathing through the woods. And there at the center stood the alpha, Shadow. Her scar caught the light as she turned her head toward him. He froze, not out of fear this time, but awe. The pack formed a semicircle, spreading quietly across the clearing. Daniel's heart pounded, not from danger but from understanding. They weren't hunting, they weren't prowling, they were waiting for him. He lowered his gaze, stepping slowly into the open. He could feel their eyes on him, unblinking, calm, deliberate. Shadow didn't move. Her breath steamed in the cold, steady and slow. He realized she wasn't just leading them. She was teaching them to look at him but not to attack. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Only breath. Only the sound of melting, ice dripping from the trees. So he did the only thing he could. He knelt. Right there in the cold mud, the rifle still slung across his back but forgotten. He lowered his head, not in fear, but in apology. The forest stood still. The wolves didn't move. Then Shadow took a step forward, one, then another. She stopped within a few yards of him, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. No predator, No prey, just two souls bound by a mistake neither he could undo. Then she turned, slow and deliberate, and looked back toward the trees. A smaller wolf, younger, stepped out from behind her, limping slightly. Its fur was pale, almost silver, and its gait uneven. Daniel saw the scar on its shoulder, small, fresh, and in the same place where she had once been hit. She had brought her pack home, but she had also brought a message, a reminder that life continues even after pain, that the cycle never breaks, it only learns. The next morning, the frost melted early. Mist rolled through the valley like a slow-moving river, wrapping the fields in silence. Daniel stepped outside without his rifle for the first time in months. The air smelled different, softer, like pine and rain. He could feel the forest breathing. He walked toward the clearing where it had all happened, the place where the bullet had fallen, where his life had split in two. The ground there was bare, the snow melted to reveal a small circle of earth. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just stillness. And then he heard it. Not a howl this time, but a low, steady breath behind him. He turned slowly. Shadow stood at the edge of the field, her fur glistening with dew, her pack spread behind her like a living horizon. The morning sun caught the air between them, turning it gold. Her eyes met his, not sharp, not soft, just knowing. For a long moment, neither moved. Time hung between heartbeats. Daniel lowered his head again the way he had before, but this time it wasn't guilt that guided him. It was gratitude. When he looked up, she was closer. Close enough that he could hear her breathing. Close enough to see the scar that had never really healed. She stepped forward until they stood face to face, man and wolf. The world around them fell away. No sound, no wind, just the two of them and the echo of everything that had been lost. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. But Daniel felt something shift inside him. Forgiveness isn't a word, he thought. It's a silence that no longer hurts. Then she turned. The pack followed without a sound, fading into the mist the same way they had come. Only Shadow looked back once more, a single glance that carried both farewell and peace. And as the light broke through the clouds, Daniel saw the younger wolf trailing behind her, limping slightly but strong, alive. He stood there long after they had gone, hands trembling, eyes wet. The forest was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. He realized something profound. She hadn't come back to haunt him. She had come back to teach him how to listen. And somewhere in that quiet morning, for the first time in nearly a year, Daniel whispered, "Thank you." The forest remembers. It always does. Long after the wind has died and the snow has melted, it keeps the stories of those who walked beneath its branches, the hunters, the hunted, and the ones who became both. Somewhere, deep among the pines, a paw print fades, a scar heals, and life continues its quiet rhythm. Not with vengeance, but with balance. Daniel never saw the wolves again, but every dawn, when the fog lifted from the hills, he would see shapes moving through the mist, silhouettes that disappeared before he could be sure they were real. He didn't need proof anymore. The sound of the forest had changed, and so had he. He no longer feared the howls that rose from the distance. He listened to them the way one listens to a prayer. Because forgiveness, he had learned, doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to carry it. Some nights, when the moon burned white over the valley, he would whisper her name into the wind, Shadow. And though no voice ever answered, the trees seemed to sway a little softer, as if something unseen still watched over the land, a reminder that even in silence, the wild speaks, and those who listen will always hear her return.